The Empirical Energy Podcast blows open the silent revolution, rewriting the rules of global energy markets. Measured, verified energy is no longer an alternative. It's becoming the gold standard. We dive deep with the producers, traders, consultants, and renegades driving this seismic shift. Step inside the raw mechanics of how verification and blockchain-fueled trading are dismantling the old systems and creating a future where alternative energy doesn't just compete, it takes over. This is the movement of reshaping energy as we know it, bold, unstoppable, and just getting started. Here is your host, Mark Smith.
All right, everybody, this is Mark Smith, host of the Empirical Energy Network, and I'm here with Natan Shahar. And just for the record, Natan and I have talked about specific projects actually in New York and how our two companies might work together in the future. But I'm excited to have you here, Natan.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for making the time.
So tell me about your background, how you end up starting your company, Standard Carbon, and then explain what the heck, because it was new for me, what electric gas is all about.
Sure, absolutely. So I started out in New York City doing building energy efficiency audits and energy consulting services, primarily for real estate throughout the New York City area, New Jersey as well, but concentrated certainly in Manhattan and the outer boroughs. And what's unique about this building stock is that it is more than 100 years old. And you don't find that in many parts of the world to the same degree because of the world wars and just sort of development cycles. And then in addition to that, you have very intense weather in New York City. So brutally cold, freeze to death winters where heat is a necessity, not a luxury. And also sweltering, humid, hot summers where if you don't have air conditioning, you don't really work effectively. So on top of that, the infrastructure is 100 years old. And on top of that, back in 2019, New York City passed the most strict climate law on the planet, the highest priced carbon tax on the planet, $268 a ton of CO2 emitted. That's the price. It's more than 3 times the European Union cap and trade price. You really don't find it anywhere. So that law was passed in 2019 with it set to apply for the first time in 2025, last year. And the conventional wisdom at the time in 2019 was, well, for sure, this will somehow get watered down, it'll get repealed, or it can't possibly go forward in its current form. Surprise, and lo and behold, it has, and it did. And it's because at the time, I couldn't act based off of the gut impulse of maybe this law will go away, but I had to give a solution to my customer base, which at the time was many of the largest landlords in New York City, of what do they do about this law that's facing them in 7 years. That's how I discovered electric natural gas, because all of these buildings have boilers that originally burned coal, and then they were upgraded to oil, and many since have been upgraded to natural gas. Many of them are still on oil, but they heat with one pipe steam systems that are state of the art for 1920, but a bit out of date compared to normative practices today. And to make matters even worse, a lot of these buildings were designed around just after the Spanish flu in 1919, when building code was that you had to be able to keep the room warm and comfortable on the coldest day of the winter with all of the windows open to provide ventilation. So just imagine the amount of heat you need on a freezing, 15-degree Fahrenheit gusty day in New York City with all the windows open, and somehow you're supposed to be comfortable. That's an enormous amount of radiator steam and therefore enormous amount of combustion going on in the boiler. So the challenge becomes, okay, now if we're going to be taxed hundreds, in some cases millions of dollars annually under this new law, but we can't affordably dismantle the steam distribution system and dismantle our boilers and everything else, what do we do? And at the time, I was reading a book about actually Mars missions, believe it or not. And the book focused on taking the CO2 atmosphere of Mars and turning it into rocket fuel for the return journey. And it presented that as a solution to make Mars more affordable. So I said, well, if you can do it with the Martian atmosphere, presumably it's a lot easier to do it in the chimney of a building here on Earth rather than having to engineer all of this, how many millions of miles away on the other side of the solar system. And so I started to read more, and then I found out actually it wasn't a new idea at all, that turning carbon dioxide into natural gas is a chemical process that's been known for more than 100 years. It's called the Sabatier reaction, 19th century chemistry. And there are, decades of sort of academic literature and papers about it, primarily in Europe and Japan, that say the way you can store intermittent sources of electricity, solar and wind, for long durations or even seasonal durations is to use that electricity to create hydrogen, combine that hydrogen with carbon dioxide to create methane, and now you have natural gas, which you can store in the distribution and pipeline network essentially forever. And that's the Sabatier reaction. It's hydrogen and carbon dioxide together, produces over a nickel catalyst, produces methane. It's fairly easy to engineer and execute. It's just a concept that hasn't been applied at scale yet, though there are many companies that are working at it. So I said, this could work theoretically because we could capture the CO2 from the boilers. That we know how to do. We could combine it with hydrogen to create methane, and then we have natural gas, and we can just put it back in the pipeline and then feed the boilers, and problem solved. The only question at the time that I wasn't aware, that I had to sort of clarify, was, is it possible to produce hydrogen cheap enough to make any of this pencil out financially? And so this was back in 2019. I looked at the electricity markets in New York City, the spot market for electricity in New York City. Now, at the time, they still had a nuclear power plant on the grid in New York since it's been decommissioned. So what that nuclear plant did to the cost of power on the open market was, at 2 o'clock in the morning, it produced way more power than the city needed. And so prices were often zero or even negative. They were paying people to take power for a significant portion of the time at 2, 3, 4, 5 in the morning. And said, okay, I said, so we do have a business because we can use this essentially free electricity to create hydrogen during the dark hours of the morning, and then combine that hydrogen immediately with carbon dioxide that we've stored up from the boilers operations during the day. And there we have natural gas, and we just put it back into the pipeline right there in the building, and it feeds the boilers, and we're good to go. And at that point, I said, okay, now let me just go shopping and find equipment and sell this. And then I discovered there was nothing really to buy. That while the engineering and the science behind everything I wanted to do, carbon capture, producing hydrogen from water, and methanation, was well known, there was no easy products to purchase to sort of integrate these into a compact form that you could install in a building. And so that was really the origins of Standard Carbon, developing the product.
And so this image that's above your head here, what is that? Is that one of the units that you
Yes.
had to put together? Okay.
So what you see behind me is the blue box is a cogeneration unit. So that's like, for your American listeners more familiar with a T-cogen, it's a reciprocating engine, combined heat and power unit, burns gas, produces electricity and hot water, 150 kilowatts. So very similar in size to what you would see in a building or similar industrial application. And then right next to it, that skid is the first Standard Carbon product, the first carbon bridge, if you will, that takes the exhaust from the generator and turns it back into natural gas, running through the processes of carbon capture and then electrolysis to produce hydrogen, and then combining the hydrogen and the carbon dioxide together to produce methane. So this was the first system that we deployed in Israel in September 2023, and our second pilot is currently active at City College in New York City that we just installed this past summer, August of 2025. So it's been a long road, relatively speaking, 7.5 years, but we've managed to install it and demonstrate it now twice. And so we're very focused on servicing customers really in all sorts of applications, not just the urban built environment, but power plants, industry, upgrading sort of CO2 from biodigesters into natural gas, as well as remote. There are a lot of remote power applications as well, where it's just we offer a way to turn renewable electricity into a storable fuel. So for long duration energy storage, there's a lot of opportunities there.
So you mentioned like renewable natural gas. How is this different than renewable natural gas, RNG?
I'd say that the biggest difference between what we're doing and biogas, well, I mean, from many perspectives, but on a technical level, what we're doing is 100% synthetic. There's no bacteria or living process to produce this. We're taking two chemicals, which basically CO2, or two compounds, CO2 on the one hand, and then water on the other. Those are the two sort of inputs. We run them through a process that's essentially instantaneous by adding electricity. So we take electricity, water, and CO2, and we get natural gas instantly, and we can produce it at any scale that's needed. It's just a function of the size of the equipment. As opposed to biogas, it's contingent on how much manure can you load into a digester, or how much trash is in the landfill, and then how cooperative are your bacteria in producing that biogas. And then what you get out is far more variable in terms of the final composition. So there's a lot of cleaning that's involved. In our case, we're producing pure methane. So what we create is cleaner, or more distilled, if you will, than even the natural gas you're getting out of the Marcellus Shale or the Permian Basin.
With this, you mentioned some of the highest sort of taxes, carbon taxes for this LL97 program in New York. So what's the flip side? Like how does someone avoid paying those taxes, and is there a premium then associated with producing this?
So building owners are faced with a few choices. They can pay the fine, obviously, or they can replace their combustion equipment entirely with an electrically heated system, heat pump, or even resistance heating, one way or the other. They could, or electric boilers, but they could completely remove all of the existing fuel-fired boilers and put in some type of electric heating system. What we're offering them is to install the machine at the building and essentially recycle the carbon atoms, recycle the fuel, the carbon dioxide back into fuel, back into carbon dioxide in a closed loop, and to drive that with bursts of intermittent electricity, which can be purchased when it's cheap, as opposed to being tied into buying electricity when it's expensive due to demand charges and everything else. This particular law has a clause for alternative fuels, where if you have a fuel that has a different life cycle analysis carbon intensity than regular fossil fuels, you can submit that fuel to the New York City Department of Buildings. They assess it, they'll give a score, and based off that, a building can significantly reduce their carbon emissions simply by purchasing a low carbon fuel. So that's the other pathway.
So speaking of that, so that have you been able to get your device system Carbon Bridge approved by New York?
We are in the process. We submitted everything in November, and we've gone back and forth. So we're very much in the weeds, and that's being driven primarily by City College. One of the reasons why we deployed in the summer at City College was to give the Earth Engineering Center and the Chemical Engineering Department there sort of the ability to really lead the charge with respect to the local regulations. I mean, at the same time, that we're part of a larger international consortium called the Electric Natural Gas Coalition, which includes Shell, Mitsubishi, Total, Tokyo Gas, Osaka Gas, and several other major Japanese, Korean, and European energy companies, as well as a handful of US startups as well, that are all focused on developing basically these electric natural gas synthetic methane projects, and have done a lot of the regulatory lobbying to get us recognition with the European Commission, with the US EPA and IRS with respect to the 45Z clean fuel tax credit here, with Énergir in Quebec. They have an explicit program for synthetic natural gas. Also with NYSERDA, we actually applied. They have a program for electric natural gas. They just released a funding program opportunity notice for that. So while the regulatory framework in New York City is still being developed with respect to what we're doing on a state, national, and then international level, it's completely fleshed out, if you will. So it's
Well,
just
those
a
sound like
matter
some
of
pretty
going
big
through the
players then
steps.
that are part of that electric gas sort of, you said consortium or a coalition. So they're all working on not only the technology, but scaling and regulation and I guess maybe even certification. So like what kind of, I mean, you're going through the college to get it approved, but like is there another certification at an international level that you're looking at, and what do you need to do to get that?
The international certification is already done, if you will. So this is a case where we are already certified with the European Commission for renewable fuels of non-biological origin. We're already recognized. I applied to the California Air Resource Board back in 2022 for the low carbon fuel standard, and they were very excited about what we're doing. As I said, we're already recognized for the 45Z clean fuels tax credit in the US because we use the same GREET modeling approach. So it's really just a matter of going through the procedural process with New York City with its own unique cast of characters, if you will, to get to the end result.
So with your background being in New York and everything kind of coming together, do you see this New York as sort of your number one opportunity you're pursuing, and what might be a number two or three? I mean, do you compare notes with the other members of the Electric Gas Association and saying, hey, what are the projects that you're pursuing? Or are they all sort of in a similar state of trying to prove out proof of concept projects and things like that?
So actually, we similar to the other members of the coalition, our primary focus has actually not been on the urban vertical in New York City. Of course, that was the impetus for the idea. And we've come first full circle in the sense that now we're selling in New York City because the law was unchanged. And so the carbon tax is so high and there is that opportunity. But of course, the first thing my investors did when I got started was say, this whole urban thing sounds, lots of small scale projects, impossible to do anything in New York. This is crazy. Let's go talk to utilities and power companies and chemical manufacturers and everybody else. And that's what we've done. And that's what the other companies in the coalition are doing as well. So we have a proposal on the desk of the largest oil refinery in Romania, where there are enormous European Union incentives, and they have enormous carbon emissions and incentive to decarbonize their plant. And we are working with the Israel Electric Corporation to decarbonize a 1.3 gigawatt power plant outside of Haifa. We have discussions ongoing with operators of several peaker plants in New York State, one in Buffalo, 53 megawatts, that's dedicated solely to actually crypto mining servers, believe it or not. And New York State refuses to renew their air permit because of the carbon emissions. So we're a solution that they're very focused on. So those are the types of projects that people in the coalition are really focused on. There's a project being developed in Nebraska, Twin Oaks, to take CO2 from ethanol plants and turn it into low carbon natural gas through this process and actually ship it to Japan. So Osaka Gas and Tokyo Gas are the off takers, and that's being developed by a company called Tree Energy Solutions based in Brussels. So there are a broad array of players. What makes New York City unique is that these property owners are stuck. So the reason why we came to approach that market is literally a lot of the folks I've been working with for years said, look, either you give me a solution that lets me keep my building as is, that doesn't require me to rip apart my existing heating system, or I will just receive violations and wait to pay the fine until they actually force me to do so. But hopefully there'll be a class action lawsuit or something like that challenging the city. That was the attitude of dozens of landlords I spoke to. So when I said to them, I said, look, I have this solution, we are a startup and this is where we're at. We can work with you. Certainly it will lower your carbon emissions. That's, the case, and you'll get to keep your boiler. They said, please sign me up, because anything I can do to be a good citizen and comply that doesn't force me to take a wrecking ball to the boiler that I just purchased 5 years ago, and according to the IRS, I'm supposed to depreciate over 30 years. So how can I retire it today? Is interesting to me, and that's really what's driven the sale. So there's, that doesn't happen often in energy or in infrastructure, where you have a market where the sales cycle can be days. All these utility contracts I'm talking about, this is a years long sales cycle or more, from first contact, and you have to go through studies, and it's a extremely laborious and expensive process, frankly, selling to a large power plant or industrial customer. In this case, you have
Well, you
landlords who
mentioned,
are ready to move fast.
okay, all right. I mean, that's good. And so, I would imagine as the LL97 regulation ramps up in terms of, penalties and stuff, that people get more motivated. I don't know what the ramp up period is, but
Oh, no, you're correct. So the vast majority of properties in 2025 do not have fines, but those that do, they can be very severe. And then by 2030, pretty much 90% of properties are facing crushingly expensive fines that make it imperative that they do something.
so you mentioned some of the other members, and there's some of the same names that I run into with LNG. And so, right now as we're recording this, there's a war going on, and the Straits of Hormuz are, complex to the point where second largest exporter of LNG is like saying, "Hey, we're stopping. We're not going to be, producing LNG and sending it through the Straits." So, how would the solution, have impacted that if it was going at scale or whatever?
So, the bottom line is that anywhere that you have combustion exhaust, you can produce natural gas from intermittent sources of electricity. So Germany has quite a bit of wind. Now, sometimes you have a still day and they're burning gas for most of their power, but on other days the entire grid is powered by wind. So to the extent that we're able to help in a situation in a location like that that's dependent on liquefied natural gas imports, we can enable them to take wind power when they have it, turn it into natural gas locally, domestically, in country, store it there, and then it's there for when they need it. So to the extent that you have significant sources of renewable electricity, or even nuclear power that's typically not fully utilized during the off-peak window, then we can turn all of that sort of inelastic source of electricity into natural gas that can be stored indefinitely and at scale for use later. In Europe, they typically purchase natural gas and fill storage reservoirs 6 months in advance of when it's used. So liquefied natural gas being delivered to Europe today is for the summer already, for August, September. It's not for tomorrow. Just to give everybody sort of an idea, it's not like a battery where you're storing a few hours or even a day of electricity. This is, you can store months worth of energy demand within the natural gas distribution network. And the same is true in North America, though in North America they have all the natural gas they need. But in a place like Japan or Taiwan or Europe, where they're dependent on imports, this is a security play as much as a financial opportunity.
So where are the ideal scenarios? So when certain things happen or there's a demand, when does this, electric natural gas really come in?
Well, look, if you have in New York City, you have a perfect storm because you have extremely old infrastructure and an extremely expensive carbon tax colliding to really force people to move fast and to move towards a solution like this. If you zoom out in general, the best opportunities are places where you have a lot of inelastic sources of electricity or a lot of inelastic electricity supply during times of low demand and a lack of fossil fuels in general to make up for that, either due to decarbonization mandates or just to a lack of physical proximity. So I mentioned Germany. Germany is a classic case. They have tons of wind, which is intermittent, and when it's going, it's typically producing at a time where demand is low, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, and they have no fossil fuels of their own. So to the extent they can turn that wind into natural gas to be used on demand, that's very useful. And gas prices are relatively expensive because Europe doesn't have their own fossil fuels at scale anyway. Japan is similar in that respect. And then even in North America, within certain markets, that's the case as well. So New England is not connected to the gas grid in the way much of the rest of the country is, just due to the quirks of the way the pipelines have been laid and geography. So that's another example of where there's a lot of wind opportunity, and to the extent you have more wind power, that can be turned into gas, and the price signals there are a little different than other parts of North America. So that's really the trick. Do you have off-peak electricity that's very cheap that you can turn into natural gas that's worth more than the cost of that power?
And if this, I mean, in this case, you're capturing carbon, and instead of, sequestering it, you're actually storing it until you find the renewable electricity to use those in combination and get it back into methane. So, I mean, I guess it could be an interesting play, like if some off taker said, "Hey, I need a blend." So, like one of the certifications we've worked on is ISCC CFC or IFCC Plus, which I think you've worked on as well. Requires a mass balance, which you have a closed loop system, so that's all possible. So if they needed a blend, and they had the natural gas infrastructure, but they couldn't get RNG into the same infrastructure. This would be interesting. I mean, if you could just like find yourself someplace, and typically, I think we were talking before, compressor stations is a very interesting place because you have large volumes of gas going through there. So, but they may not have any RNG nearby, because farms aren't necessarily next to the gas processing plants. But you could plop one of your devices there, grab exhaust, and if you could get a source of, it would technically work with any electricity, but I think for the credits, you need renewable electricity. Is that it?
It works, correct. It works with any form of electricity.
Yeah.
Depending on the jurisdiction, that power needs to be wind, solar, nuclear, and or hydro, either run of river or dam. And then to complicate matters more, potentially the wind or solar has to be incremental, i.e., new or obviously was going to be curtailed. So the rules are complex, but fundamentally speaking, The formula that we give the power traders we work with is, cost of electricity must be less than value of gas produced without the environmental attributes, or cost of electricity must be less than the value of the gas produced with the environmental attributes. And so they plug that in and say, okay, look, I have some cheap off-peak coal power, and it's going to enable me to let you produce natural gas at Henry Hub prices. So great. Why not? I mean, I would argue that any wasted electrons are a form of sort of renewable or environmentally benign energy, because if it was going to be wasted anyway, then that's far worse than not using it and then causing stress on the grid elsewhere at a later stage. But regardless, the fundamental concept is that we're just looking at the value of the environmental attributes, the value of the gas itself, relative to the cost of the power.
Interesting. And yeah, so it requires empirical energy, meaning it has to be, especially if you're creating EACs, environmental attribute certificates. Very interesting. And then the CI score that you get with that would be, is it negative? So that you could add it, like if you added your...
So the CI score, excellent question. So the CI score is a function, the carbon intensity is a function of the source of the carbon dioxide and the source of electricity. So if in an ideal scenario, if 100% of the electricity is renewable, and say from solar or wind, and 100% of the carbon dioxide is from a biogenic source, so it's from an anaerobic digester, then in that case, the gas we produce has a negative CI score, similar to the highest grade of biogas, because effectively we're removing CO2 that was released into the air biogenically. So it's like we're like a tree, we're a form of almost like direct air capture, right? So then it's a negative carbon intensity. On the other hand, if you use that biogenic CO2 with dirty power from a coal power plant, then the carbon intensity of that electricity is obviously much higher. And so the carbon intensity of the gas when you burn it will be commensurately increased. There's a good chance it'll still be less than fossil fuels, but it will be more similar to, say, landfill natural gas or other grades of renewable biogas that don't necessarily have the negative scores, such as, cattle feedlot renewable natural gas doesn't have the same as dairy natural gas, and so on and so forth. And then, so too, which is most of our applications, if you have point source CO2 from combustion of fossil fuels, which is really the infinite market, that's where you have an infinite amount of CO2, then you can't get a negative score, because you can just sort of count the CO2 captured against the CO2 released when the fuel is burned. And so in that case, the reduction in the carbon intensity is purely a function of the carbon intensity of the electricity. So if you had 100% renewable power, you could get a CI score of close to 0. Realistically speaking, you're looking at a carbon intensity that's going to be to a 60 to 75% reduction on fossil fuel natural gas. So you're going to be around 20.
So if people want to get a hold of you and follow how the New York project is going or any of the other projects, what's the best way to do that?
Website, standardcarbon.com, or find me on LinkedIn. I'm hyper responsive on LinkedIn, so anybody who finds me on LinkedIn, I'll respond. But also the contact form on our website, standardcarbon.com, we answer queries.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Natan. Appreciate it. And I'm keenly interested in the project, mainly because we help clients get ISCC certified. But anyway, appreciate it. Thanks.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Okay.
The Empirical Energy Podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, Rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.